we have a fantastic episode today. We are very lucky to have Jeremy Berke here, the founder and editor-in-chief of Cultivated. I'll put it really bluntly. If you're not reading Cultivated, you should be. Cultivated News is basically the best way to make sense of what's going on for operators, investors, and policymakers. Jeremy, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. I'm happy to be here and always a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, well, what a momentous day. So we're going to jump right into it. So right now, you and I both have Twitter up. It's Friday, August 7th.
Yeah.
You had a really interesting framing this morning, talking about how cannabis policy gets made. Let me quote you: haphazardly, in a rush, and bolted on to something else that it shouldn't be. Can you set the stage for me here? How are we in a place where we might have a government shutdown fight over THC gummies sold in a gas station?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll make this as pithy as possible because, the hemp and cannabis policy in the U.S. is complex and there are nuances. So we can start back in 2018. There was what some call a loophole in the Farm Bill, and I use that carefully because, a lot of people say it wasn't a loophole, it was intentional. But whatever it may be, that the Farm Bill allowed THC derived from hemp, and hemp and cannabis are the same plant. Hemp just does not contain usable amounts of THC under 0.3. So the 2018 Farm Bill allowed hemp-derived THC products to flourish around the U.S. So these, basically, they took that 0.3% THC. THCA is naturally occurring in the hemp plant, and they can make things like drinks, gummies, beverages, whatever it may be that have actual intoxicating effects, so upwards of 5-10 milligrams of THC. Over the last 8 years, these products have shown up in Target and in gas stations, like all over the country, right? It took until November of last year for some of the original authors of the 2018 Farm Bill, including Senator Mitch McConnell, who I believe is still alive, I'm not sure, to realize the mistake they had made, right? And so what they did was they inserted language during the government shutdown into the last funding bill that was set to keep the government open, basically shutting the loophole and lowering the threshold to 0.4 milligrams of THC being the definition of hemp by dry weight, so not a concentration. And so that means that any product that has hemp-derived THC, if this language goes into effect, which it's set to go into effect in November, has to be under that 0.4 milligram threshold. Now, that does include a lot of non-intoxicating products as well, which we can get into later. So, most CBD products that people are buying for sleep or pain relief or whatever it may be will actually sort of go above that threshold sometimes. And even the raw material will too, depending on when it's harvested. So again, this is all very complex. Flash forward to today. There is new language in the continuing resolution that will avoid a government shutdown ahead of the midterms that basically extends the ban a month. And extending the ban a month theoretically will give lawmakers and policymakers time to negotiate a new bill. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical because they've had 9 months and a new bill hasn't been developed. And so what is another 4 weeks going to do? I'm not sure, but there are bills circulating around Congress to do so. So look, I don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. A lot of Senate Republicans are now fighting. They want the ban instituted right away. And these are sort of, the classic reefer madness arguments that you expect of social conservatives. They don't want THC products being sold around the country. Some are a little bit educated enough about the policy to separate synthetic cannabis, things like Delta 8. This is the kind of gas station weed that you hear referred to in the press from, real naturally occurring THC products, right? And so, we will see if that distinction remains. But look, Republicans are fighting this tooth and nail. They want the ban to come. However, when I say Republicans, I am not including President Donald Trump, who wants to see the ban extended, and he has his own reasons. He's been, for Republican president, he's been relatively pro-cannabis, shepherding rescheduling and other cannabis reform as well. And so, look, this issue is now driving a wedge in the Republican Party. At the same time, why I say it's haphazard is that we are dealing with all these very complex policy issues. There's many businesses built on this language, and there are many employees who rely on this language for their next paycheck. many consumers who rely on it to get their pain relief or to get the products they want to use on the weekend, et cetera. And we're doing it haphazardly, attached to a must-pass funding bill ahead of the midterm. So instead of being proactive, it is very reactive policymaking.
And here's an interesting wrinkle, right? Senator Bud is basically no friend of Bud, and I'm going to make that pun. Now it's over. And he basically about 40 minutes ago said he thinks he has the votes to pass his hemp products amendment, stripping out a delay at the ban, and he is adamant about that. Can you walk us through what might happen if he's correct? If he is correct that he can split out this amendment, what are the consequences for the industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, so the original ban that was inserted last year would go into effect on November 12th. And so look, like that is about, 3 months where companies that have been built and developed supply chains to sell hemp-derived THC products, all the inventory will not be saleable after that date on November 12th. So that's probably millions of dollars of inventory. That's consumers, especially in states where cannabis isn't legal, like Texas, Idaho, et cetera, that will not have access to these THC products immediately on November 13th. So it's hugely, hugely impactful for these hemp businesses, specifically. It's also hugely impactful for the cannabis industry in a different way, right? There's a couple things going on here. It was earnings week for a lot of the big MSOs, the big publicly traded American cannabis companies. And you heard a lot of the CEOs talk about how they saw an increase in cannabis sales when Ohio, which sort of front ran the federal ban, instituted its own ban on hemp-derived products. So basically forcing consumers back into the state-regulated channel. And so for them, like there is, a small win here, right? Like their next quarterly sales will probably be boosted if that hemp-derived consumer channel is gone. But at the same time, in my view, and this is one person's view, right? I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying, in my view, that it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because, once consumers get used to buying THC products in Target, when they go pick up lettuce or light bulbs or, shirts, like whatever you go to Target for, that's a very, very hard muscle to unlearn. And so it is very true that these hemp-derived THC products, especially low-dose beverages and gummies, et cetera, are very palatable to non-core cannabis consumers and are very good at normalizing the industry in their eyes. And so, I think on the one hand, look, like, I see where the MSOs are coming from. They have to pay, expensive licensing fees, and dispensaries are difficult retail channels compared to any other sort of industry, right? They have to pay compliance costs. And so there is an unfair playing field. But at the same time, like these products have really normalized cannabis for Americans, especially in red states that don't have legal cannabis sales and might never have legal cannabis sales. And so, I think the stakes for the cannabis industry are frankly enormous for this. At the same time, in the broad scheme of things, like funding the government is much more important than hemp and cannabis policy, right? And so it's odd that, it's just so impactful for all of us who think about this and talk about this every single day. But in the grand scheme of things, this is a small industry and, a relatively small consumer market compared to other things. And so, like, it befuddles me why we can't be proactive about policymaking about this. Instead, we have to do it in such an emergency, rushed fashion. But, that's U.S. politics.
Yeah, the idea of them just writing a bill to deal with this issue is apparently so foreign to them that we now get to the pants on fire and everybody's running around.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the point I was trying to make in my story, right? Is that, like, it's hard and it's complicated, but it's not that hard and it's not that complicated, right? Like we can do this. If we could put a man on the moon in the 60s, we can write, comprehensive cannabis regulation that makes sense for the market, for consumers, for public health, even for people that are opposed to legalization itself. But it seems hard to do that. And I think, look, like, one thing that I've written about in my newsletter is that this whole hemp cannabis bifurcation is purely created by policy, right? It's not because, some consumers prefer hemp derived THC over other forms of THC. If you look at Canada, which just has blanket federal legalization, it's all just THC. Like that is what consumers want. So, in my view, like drawing up comprehensive regulations about the molecule itself versus where the raw material comes from would be the way to go.
Yeah, well, that's too much common sense, my friend.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I have kind of an interesting question for people who might not have your level of sophistication when it comes to politics. And we'll move on to some of the meatier stuff too. You know, this split in the GOP is crazy. You know, Trump has had an iron fist over Republicans
Yeah.
on pretty much every issue, and then you've got weirdly a guy who used to criticize the hell out of him, Rand Paul, on his side. And I want to ask you, how much of this do you believe?
Um, yeah, look, like it's a really good question, and I'm taking a beat to think about it because, as a journalist, I'm always wary of the idea that someone on the opposing side of an issue to yourself has bad intentions. It's very, very easy to always fall into that trap and to be cynical of that. I think, there are people with very good intentions who might just view the world differently than I do, or have differing interpretations of the evidence, whether that's anecdotal or whether it's, quantifiable, right? I'm willing to say that. And so, look, I do think that however much I disagree with many of the Republican social conservatives, like Senator Ted Budd. It's a terrible name for this. I agree with you there. Um, I do believe he thinks he's saving the children. Like he thinks he's doing the right thing, and he is willing, to go against President Trump, who has had a stranglehold, as you pointed out, on the Republican Party, and he's willing to, I don't know if it's going to risk a shutdown or not. I don't want to say that, but he's actually willing to make that risk. So look, like I think, it's fair to say that this is probably a principled stand on his part. That being said, it doesn't mean the principled stand is right or correct. It just means that it's coming from his own principles. Uh, you know, for President Trump, I think it's fair to say, one, that he is compelled, as a senior citizen himself, as someone who, golfs and talks to seniors in Florida, like he's compelled by the medical aspects of cannabis legalization. That's really why he pushed rescheduling. I think he's sympathetic to those arguments. He sees it works. Whether or not he uses it himself, I'm not sure. At the same time, supporting cannabis reform is very good politics for him. And I think his inapproval rating, uh, touch the 60s, right? He's one of the least popular presidents in modern history. And meanwhile, over around 60% of Americans support legalization. So look, like there's going to be contentious midterms. He's going to be a lame duck after the midterms. This is really good politics for him to support THC in any form. I don't think he's aware of the nuances that actually, half the cannabis industry wants to see the ban go through. I don't know if that's filtering up to him in the same way. It may be, it may not be, but, look, like I'm skeptical of everyone. I try not to be cynical as a reporter because I think people do, take stands on principle. Look, that being said, again, it's opportunistic. And also, like, there is a lot of reporting. I want to be sort of careful how I say this because it's not my reporting, but, the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who is very, very influential with Trump himself and in the White House, her son-in-law runs a rather large hemp business. And so, like anything, in the world of Donald Trump, like, you can't avoid that. Whether that is true or not, the optics are extremely clear there as well for why he would be inserting himself into this fight.
Yeah, and I love that, and this next question kind of plays into that. You know, we tackled a little bit of kind of the political dynamics. You and I both know that if the trajectory holds right now in November, it likely that President Trump will be facing, at a minimum,
Yeah.
one half of our legislative body that's not going to be helping him in any way, shape, or form. Let's walk down the worst case scenario. You know, Senator Budd is telling the truth. He can kill this, right? Let's assume that he's got it and he's going to kill it. What does that look like, even if the Senate and the Democrats take the Senate and the House? Can operators in our industry count on any kind of relief, or do you think it's way more complex than that?
Um, can operators count on relief? I am not an operator. I would not count on any help from the federal government. I mean, I think, I made this point earlier that, look, like Colorado first legalized cannabis in 2012. We're 14 years into this. Like, we're still having these debates. I would not count on any sort of proactive relief. However, if I put on my rose-colored glasses a little bit, cannabis policy is one of the few areas where Democrats can actually work with Donald Trump. And so, if Michigan flips, and the Democrats do take both the House and the Senate, it's likely that we will see a lot of cannabis bills come through Congress. And if one manages to pass, I mean, I think getting to 60 votes in the Senate is going to be a lot harder than getting to 51, but, we can have that discussion. But if they pass the filibuster threshold and get to 60 votes, like, there is a chance that Donald Trump needs some sort of win, and that Democrats find that this is a way they can work with him. And cannabis is one of the issues that breaks through. I think that's a small chance, but I think, there are very real scenarios where I see that occurring. That being said, right, like, I get asked this question all the time. If I am an operator, I am not counting on anything from Congress or the federal government. I'm going to stay in my own lane and work in state houses where policy is a little bit more nimble, and I'm going to sell what I can sell and do what I can do and comply with what I'm supposed to comply with. And if the federal government moves, that's a nice to have, not a need to have.
I've got one more on this, and I want to pivot to Schedule 3.
Mm-hmm.
Look, you hinted at it earlier. Green Thumb, Curaleaf, they've got earnings calls. Verona already mentioned this. And then you also
Yeah.
have written that the alcohol industry has a proven playbook for killing cannabis. So when you look at both the big cannabis sector and the big alcohol sector,
Mm-hmm.
and God knows they both have donated so much money to, in the cannabis side to President Trump. And of course, the alcohol lobby has been donating millions and millions for years. What is your reporting or what is your instinct on who's really behind some of these efforts to just gut the cannabis industry?
Yeah. I, I can only speculate. Right. I think it is two things. I think one is that, the pharmaceutical and alcohol lobby, like when we talk about big cannabis, in the grand scheme of things, these are like small market cap companies, right? Like they're dwarfed by companies like Johnson and Johnson, Anheuser-Busch. Like these are mega cap corporations who are very large, who have decades long relationships with policymakers and Congress and state houses, who can spend, 7-8 figures on lobbying. And it's sort of like, a throwaway line item, on their 10Q. So look, like, are they trying to strangle it and kill it? I'm not sure. But do they clearly see a threat to their business and they're doing their fiduciary duty and acting on that threat? Like, yes, absolutely, that's happening. The second thing I'll say is that, I think, and this is sort of a relatively ill-formed political science argument, like someone else is going to come with data and tell me why I'm wrong. But, I do think that support for legalization has hit an asymptote, right? It's like the top of the curve in America. And, it's not like only less people are going to support legalization from here on out. And, it doesn't mean it's not popular. It doesn't mean that it's not, the majority opinion. It just means that like where you had maybe 61 support in 2019, you might have 55, 56% now. And so that does give an opening for, social conservatives to say, like, look at the evils of legalization. Now, their arguments are wrong, and I don't want to have that fight on the podcast, but like, it does give them that opening to say that and to go to journalists who, want to say why corporations are bad, why big companies are bad, to say, hey, look, like, we're creating this new addictive industry of big tobacco. That's a talking point, like, straight out of a very socially conservative playbook. But I do think it's resonating a little bit and it's hurting support. And the fact that Donald Trump is one of the few standard bearers, for support for cannabis, even though he stopped short of legalization in the Republican Party. As he gets less popular, the evangelicals are going to start reasserting control a little bit and saying like, oh, we don't like cannabis. We don't like all these sort of MAGA libertarian things that like the 2006 Republican Party would have sneered at. Right. And so I think there's like a little bit of a window for that right now too. So I think that's a push and a pull factor. Now, I think both of those ideas, like, if you're Anheuser-Busch, like, you're probably going to lobby against cannabis until you lose, and then you're going to figure out a distribution mechanism for, Budweiser branded THC drinks, right? Like, there's going to be a snowball effect there. And second, I think, like, even though cannabis support is declining a little bit, I do think that, just like it's hit a top, the bottom is probably still above 50%. And so, like, with any public policy that has more than 50% support, like, politics will follow. It just takes time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And now I want to pivot. You have done some excellent reporting. In fact, your team was in the room for the DEA
Yeah.
rescheduling hearings in Arlington. I'm going to just kind of skip ahead to kind of some things that really stood out to me real quick. Number one, you pointed out that an FDA official admitted on cross that cannabis would have failed the standard 5-part test, and so they kind of created a new test for it.
Yeah.
Um, Judge Julius is going to be ruling soon, I believe is his name. Um, the hearing is over. Your impression, if I'm quoting you correctly, was, both sides think that the record favors them, but boy, it sure sounds like the pro legalization side got their asses handed to them in that courtroom.
Yeah, it does, and I think Greg, like, one important thing to note is that the DEA rescheduling trial wasn't about whether cannabis is good or bad, right? It was specifically about whether that 2-part test was proper, and was proper to make that determination for the DEA to reschedule. And so to do that, all the pro side really has to prove was that cannabis does have accepted medical use, which is true. I mean, that is in medical literature, and it's already prescribed in medical only states throughout the U.S. And two, that no one has died directly from cannabis consumption. So, the pro side went in the courtroom. They took their licks from smart approaches to marijuana, and all the folks who are opposed to cannabis legalization, who carefully built a record designed for a federal appeal process to say why cannabis is evil. At the same time, that is not the core argument that the judge was supposed to hear. The judge was supposed to hear a very, very narrow argument. And I highlighted the CAMU, the currently accepted medical use test, because that was a compelling line. That was one of the few compelling lines I thought from the anti side, was that they were basically asserting that the federal government, due to political pressure from Trump, et cetera, wanted to design a test that cannabis could specifically pass. Compelling argument. I would argue, again, I'm not a lawyer, not in the courtroom, but I would argue it's not exactly true, because the 5-part test doesn't really know how to account for like a botanical plant, like cannabis, with multiple active compounds that could be efficacious for different things. It knows how to select for one molecule to test that molecule in a double-blind clinical trial, and then, figure out if it has a use case or not. And so, forcing cannabis into the 5-part test is really like, to use a terrible metaphor, jamming a square peg into a very round hole. And so cannabis was never going to pass in the first place. Now, you can criticize why they use this new test, but maybe, in general, the test just needed updating. And that is what, the federal government under Biden, the HHS, did say in the report. They said there's no possible way that cannabis can pass this test, but it is being prescribed for medical use already. But it has a very, good safety profile compared to other drugs, even like Advil. And so, look, like, maybe the test needs updating. They updated the test, and this is where they fell. There is until August 17th for statements from both sides. And so we're not going to get a ruling before August 17th, but it could come shortly after that. However, it's my view that, like, the most likely outcome here is that, the DEA does follow the trial and they do reschedule, but it's tied up in litigation. I think both sides are really preparing for a fight.
Let's talk about that. So, a lot of our audience is those operators, those people who are involved in MSOs. Where do you think this goes from here? What should we be expecting? And is there any world this gets wrapped up before the midterms, or are we looking well into 27?
I would guess that we're looking to 27, even 2028. Look, I think, it takes a sympathetic federal judge to hear the case if rescheduling goes through. And those trials can take a very long time. And so, I don't know what the outcome would be. That could be a months to years timeline. But, I don't think, like, we should count the chickens before they hatch either. Like, it's certainly possible that an outcome of this trial is that medical cannabis is rescheduled, But recreational cannabis stays on Schedule 1. I don't think that's likely. I just think it's a possibility. Number two is that there is a possibility that it is rescheduled and it gets overturned in appeal and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Like that again is a years long process. However, if I had to sort of handicap the most likely outcome, I do think it's step one, the judge reschedules fully. And step two, there's a court fight. It goes on for longer than everyone wants, but ultimately, cannabis does land at Schedule 3.
In the world that cannabis does get this rescheduling green light, Jeremy, does that policy immediately go into effect for operators while the courts rule, or is there a hard stop with some kind of injunction? Do you have any feeling on that?
I don't know, and you should ask a lawyer this. I do think it's if it goes to an appeal, there is likely to be an injunction. Like that would be the first step, and so it would stop implementing the rule. However, federal agencies can kind of like they're not getting a lot of guidance, from the administration or from federal agencies, and they can make their own determinations, right? Like if the IRS wants, it's theoretically possible. Like even if there is an injunction on applying the Schedule 3 rule, like the IRS could come up with its own restrictions or regulations around the 280E tax, let's say, right? Or state cannabis regulators or state houses themselves could say, like we believe that like they could change their own drug scheduling in front of the federal government. Now, there is a federal supremacy clause, and that would be its own fight, right? But there's like all sorts of outcomes that could possibly happen here. So look, like that's a long-winded way of saying like I honestly don't know. And I don't know when it'll happen, but I do think if there is a fight, there will be an injunction, and so it'll be a slow walk to see when things come. At the same time, like it doesn't stop other agencies in other states from making their own determinations about what they want to do.
Last question for you, Jeremy. I know you're busy. You got 1,000 media requests today.
Yeah.
My last question for you is one more Schedule 3. So we've watched the big MSOs kind of spin off their the medical side of their business for the purposes of getting uplifted to the NASDAQ or other financial goals. What, if anything, should we be reading into that, and where does it show us the future of post regulation cannabis might be?
Yeah. Two things. One, I think a lot of these MSOs they really want to be on the big boards, right? They're much more liquid. It gives them a lot more legitimacy than trading over the counter or even on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Not that that's not a legitimate exchange, but just in terms of American investors. And two, I think it opens them up to institutional investors that really sort of stabilize stock prices, that will invest in a long-term growth story versus like a short-term day trading kind of thing that all these cannabis stocks are stuck in. So I think they're all sort of clamoring to get on the big boards. The NASDAQ has been open to it, right? Trulieve and Glass House both separated in some form or fashion their medical assets from their recreational assets in order to appease the exchange regulators and say like, okay, we can list, our medical assets under Schedule 3, right? I think, you mentioned the earnings calls this week earlier, Greg, like, those questions were asked by all the bank analysts on the earnings calls, and all the CEOs said, had differing opinions. Like some said, we want to get on the boards as fast as we can or exploring every way. Others said, hey, look, like splitting our medical and our recreational business doesn't exactly make sense right now because, reading between the lines, like most of their business is recreational. So they'd be listing like, 10% of their revenue on the exchange. Is that really the story they want to tell to investors? Is that really going to get, Goldman Sachs to do a roadshow for their stock and get, Norway's pension fund, to invest and hold and buy long term? Like, no, it's not. And so, I think some companies want it to be first. Trulieve, for its part, they don't necessarily always break out in each 10Q, medical revenue versus recreational revenue. Some do, some don't. But, you can sort of estimate that Trulieve's medical business is a much larger chunk of its revenue than the other MSOs, purely because of, holding a near monopoly in Florida with an aging population. That's a lucrative medical state, right? And so, for Trulieve, it made sense. For Glasshouse, it made sense. I think, if you're Curaleaf, maybe it doesn't make sense right now. Maybe you're waiting to see how things shake out.
Jeremy, my friend, I'm going to say it one more time. First off, thank you. I know you're probably bouncing a bunch of interviews. If you are not reading Cultivated News, you should be. I'm glad that we can count on you to jump on this podcast when crazy things are happening. And just as a quick update, the Senate did the important business of confirming Chris Anderson to be the ambassador to Cambodia. So, they're well on their way to handling this mess. Anyway,
Yeah,
Jeremy, thank
I
you
mean,
so much.
Cambodia, cannabis, we're getting there. It's going through the alphabet. So,
Awesome. Thanks again, Jeremy.
yeah, thanks, Greg.